Speaking of crimes against humanity, welcome back to Perpetual Jank Machine, your number one source for misinformation about computers. I'm John.
And I'm Miles.
Miles, FTP has turned 50, at least as of the time we are recording this. So that made me think a little bit about, well, the fact that most of computer science was solved in the 1970s and late 1960s. So I figured, let's spice this up a little bit today. I have a little quiz for you about what technologies were invented when, and honestly, some of this even surprised me. The rules of the game are very simple. I have the description of the technology that was either released or first seen in commercial use or developed, and then a date and a year for it, and you're going to tell me whether it happened more than 50 years ago or less than 50 years ago. And for reference, 50 years ago was, let's call it April 18th, 1971, so the time we're recording this. Sound good?
Gotcha. Sounds good.
All right. This is going to be awesome. So let us get started. Sound effect. So, Miles, our first question is the concept itself of NP completeness. When was that done? So this was the concept of NP completeness with the Cook-Levin theorem that says that if a problem is NP complete, it can be reduced to the Boolean satisfiability problem. When did this happen? More or less than 50 years ago?
That's got to be more than 50 years ago, right?
Ooh, you're very, very close because it actually happened on May 3rd of 1971. So not when we're recording this, but quite possibly when people are listening to this, it will be more than 50 years old.
Oh my gosh, screw off. You chose that one on purpose.
But it is as of yet not 50 years old.
Oh my gosh, go
It was
away.
May 3rd through 5th for the conference that it was submitted to. All right, this next one might be a little bit easier. So we're going to go with Pong, the eponymous, iconic computer video game. When was that? More than 50 years ago or less than 50 years ago?
That's less, right? That's less.
You're right. That was done in 1972. It was first released then. As we all know, Pong is quite famous nowadays and it's been cloned in pretty much every single computer system that you could ever imagine, but it was first done in 1972 by Atari.
Thank you, Atari.
We do have computer games, so it might actually be helpful if we have things to run those computer games on. So when was the first microprocessor released? This one's going to be another hard one.
Microprocessor. I that's definitely before, it was more than 50 years ago, right?
Very, very close. This was also a hard one. It was released in November 15th of 1971, the Intel 4004. This baby was fabbed on the 10 micrometer process. For reference, nowadays we are on 7 to 5 nanometers, depending on which technology you buy, or 14 if you buy Intel. And this was kicking it off, obviously, but it's astounding how far we've come in 50 years, and I'm sure that there's going to be plenty of celebrations around the birthday of that.
Who would celebrate that? Who's like, yeah, I'm throwing a party for Intel's first microprocessor?
I guarantee the Intel newsroom is going to have more than enough material to help you celebrate, Miles. So
I mean, yeah, but I was thinking like, just like a random person who like really loved like Intel.
I'm sure those people are out there. Maybe past Intel CEOs, I don't know.
All right, fair enough.
We're going to get a little patriotic with this one, that's your hint. But when was the first ebook published? This is also a really hard one.
That's within 50 years, right?
Yep, within 50 years, but just barely. It was published on July 4th of 1971. The first ebook was actually the Declaration of Independence.
Okay, sure. This sounds so wrong. So many things about this sound so wrong.
I don't know. That's what I read on Wikipedia.
Well, if it's from Wikipedia, it's gotta be true.
It has to be right. Why wouldn't it be right?
It usually is, unfortunately.
All right. Little known company that we tend to rag on quite a bit. Was Microsoft founded more than 50 years ago or less than 50 years ago?
Less than 50 years ago.
You are right. They were founded in 1975. They sold a BASIC interpreter and had yet to create the atrocity that is NTFS.
Great. NTFS. What is that?
NTFS, that's the file system that all Windows machines still insist on using.
Oh, okay.
And it's unbearable.
Yeah. It's strange to say the least.
It's very slow. Speaking of very slow, my writing. When was the first word processor introduced? That was the worst transition ever. Oh my god.
Yeah, that was pretty. I'm still like thinking it over. I'm still churning through the transition.
Word
Okay.
processors. Word processors.
That's got to be like the first thing that was invented after computers, right? That's got to be. So that's definitely that's after 50 years.
More than 50 years ago. Hey, that's right. That was invented in the 1960s, the first physical word processor that did not use like a typewriter kind of mechanism was the IBM MTST, which stood for the Magnetic Tape Selectric, get the pun there, typewriter.
Oh.
It was released in 1964, and only a couple of years later, the first novel ever composed on a word processor was released.
Yeah, I was going to say, I was like that. I think word processing was literally one of the first things after like computers were released.
But if you do word process something, you're going to have to print it if it's in a digital medium, right? So when was the laser printer invented? More than 50 years ago or less than 50 years ago?
That seems like one of those things that was a technology, but like stayed on the shelf for a long time. So I'm going to say more than 50 years ago.
And you are correct. That was invented in 1969 at Xerox by Gary Starkweather.
Thank you, Gary.
So replacing your toner just wasn't a thing before then. Interesting. All right, that was incredibly boring. So let's go to something a little bit more fun. Let's talk about 3D graphics. When were those invented?
With the Nintendo 64, so obviously less than 50 years ago. That's obviously a joke, but I'm going to say less than 50 years.
You're right, but I included this because it's actually surprising how far back they go. The first attested 3D graphics that I was able to find was a game called Maze War in 1973.
Damn.
I know. This game was like super ahead of its time. We might come back to that eventually. Just a spoiler. But yeah, it contained wireframe graphics because obviously polygons were a little bit too cold for the tech at the time.
Everything's going to be vectors at that point.
Yeah, for sure. But 3D graphics, 1973. Who would have thunk? That's insane.
Probably someone who played that game in 1973. They're like, these guys are idiots.
I mean, computer games were barely a thing back then, so that must have been mind-blowing. Absolutely mind-blowing.
Yeah, true.
So let's go from the exciting to the even more mundane. So you're familiar with the Internet Engineering Task Force RFCs, right? Like IETF, RFC, whatever, right?
No.
Really? Oh, wow. Yeah, they published a whole bunch of like standards for internet-related junk on there. It's actually quite a big thing, but obviously, these had to have started at some time, right? So When was the first Internet Engineering Task Force RFC published? More than or less than?
Less than. I'm going to say less than.
Just barely wrong. It was published in 1969. Nice. By Steve Crocker at UCLA. It's about host software on the ARPANET. I honestly barely understand it, and that just kind of attests to how old it is. So, yeah, lots of questions, lots of open things. There's a nice ASCII diagram on the last page of it. It's an interesting read.
It does sound interesting. I'll put it on my reading list. I'll get it on my Kindle. I don't have my Kindle.
For sure. All right. The IETF is kind of known for publishing these long-standing standards, but there's a couple of other long-standing laws in computing that have really stood the test of time, and one of them is Moore's Law. When did Gordon Moore come up with this famous hypothesis?
I'm going to say more than 50 years ago.
Yep. This was published in 1965, and I'm just going to read a little snippet from it here. Certainly, over the short term, this rate can be expected to continue, if not to increase. Over the longer term, the rate of increase is a bit more uncertain, although there is no reason to believe it will not remain nearly constant for at least 10 years. Little did he know this was to continue for the next approximately 40 years, until, hilariously, Intel kind of became the butt of the joke for failing to uphold that, namely being still stuck on its 14 nanometer process for the last, what is it now, 6 years? 7 years?
I don't know.
Ugh.
They are getting pretty close to like the edges of what you can do, though.
So this one's a little bit weird, but this is a pet fascination of mine. So there's this thing called Allen calculus, which determines the relations between two time intervals. So intersecting, one time interval fully containing the other. At what points do like the starts and the ends touch, if they do at all, or they disjoint. So it just describes those relationships. There's 13 basic ones for two time spans. When was this formalized? Allen interval algebra or Allen calculus?
More than 50 years ago?
You would think. You really would, because that's like a math thing, kind of. But no, actually, it was first published in 1983, which, honestly, given how well we do times and time spans, I'm kind of not surprised it was a more recent, publication.
Fair enough. All right.
A little bit more standing the test of time on this one. So when were we given Lisp? This one's probably an easier one.
Lisp? It's I don't know nothing about Lisp.
You don't know nothing about Lisp?
Maybe within 50 years?
Miles.
I don't.
You got to go learn yourself some Lisp.
What is Lisp?
All right. Well, you can start your learning by learning that it was first formally released in 1960 and specified in 1958. So very, very old. One of the older programming languages.
I'm getting confused. Okay. Oh, okay. Yeah, no, I got what you're talking about. Okay. I do know what Lisp is. I'm
not convinced.
No, I know it was one of the earlier functional programming languages. I mean, I just looked this up, but because back in the olden times, whenever computers were first coming out, a lot of the people were scientists, and they really liked the idea of functional programming, despite it being stupid.
Ouch.
I just don't understand the appeal of it. I mean, I understand theoretically what the appeal of it is. It just seems very convoluted. Anyway.
So sad. All right. Well, on that unfortunate note, when was the minimum spanning trees algorithm invented? This is the one that we learn in data structures.
Oh, that's got to be one of the earlier ones, right? That's got to be more than 50 years old.
Yep, this one is a family of algorithms that all pretty much do the same thing, but hilariously, one of them was discovered in 1930, and then rediscovered in 1957, and then rediscovered in 1959. It's named Prim's algorithm after the first rediscovery, but there was also a minimum spanning tree algorithm by Borufka, and then there was Kruskal's algorithm in 1956.
Someone was just doing math with graph theory, and then some guy who was more in computational stuff just didn't realize that there was something in graph theory that already answered this thing or something like that.
I could imagine. I mean, it's one of those algorithms that if you're working with graphs, it kind of jumps out at you, I'd imagine. It's really not a huge leap of faith, I would say, especially if you're already Edsger Dijkstra and you're working with graphs, you're going to figure it out because you're Edsger
How
Dijkstra.
old is graph theory?
It's pretty old. I mean, all of the foundational graph search algorithms are well more than 50 years old at this point. That was a very useful invention, but let's talk about some inventions of other qualities of use. So what was the first write-only memory listed in a semiconductor's catalog?
That's got to be pretty early on. Because wasn't that a joke at one point? So I'm going to say more than 50 years ago.
More than 50 years ago? Surprisingly not. It was actually in 1972 in the Signetics catalog as a joke, obviously. Later on, this would be superseded by most modern operating systems' use of dev null as infinite write-only memory. That was a later discovery. But surprisingly, within the last 50 years, we've discovered write-only memory.
Really? I thought, I know it was a joke for a long time. I guess someone didn't actually try to really hammer the joke home for a long time.
Apparently it had a full data sheet, which I find to be very, very funny. As somebody who goes through those things fairly frequently, I would love to read that one, although I haven't bothered to track it down.
Yeah, that's probably a colossal waste of time, but probably a good read anyway.
It probably uses terminology that's a little bit older than I'm used to reading, so it might be a bit of a difficult one, but definitely if you're interested in ancient computing humor, it's a good one.
It's probably a collector's item at this point, any printed form of it.
Oh, God, I'm sure. All right. a little bit more practical, a little bit more scary. Let's talk about Shor's algorithm. This one's pretty famous for being the one that breaks RSA. When was that one done?
Wait, Shor's algorithm? Wait,
Yep.
I'm bad with names. What does that one do?
This one is the one that can factorize integers in polynomial time for certain classes of computers.
I'm going to say less than 50 years.
Yep, this is actually much less than 50 years. It was 94. So this actually runs on quantum computers, which is a significantly newer field.
Yeah, I was like, quantum theory hasn't even been that old. So it's like, it's got to be less than 50 years.
Uh-huh. I looked it up. In to date, the largest number factorized with it was 21. So,
well, that's because quantum computing hasn't got very far yet.
So for now, your encryption keys are safe. For now. I read that they tried to do 35 in 2019, but they weren't able to do it due to a whole bunch of quantum gobbledygook.
Well, don't they have to be like super cool too? So it's probably not hitting the consumer market for a very long time.
So anyway, when was the hard disk drive invented?
That's got to be another one of those things that was invented really early on, but sat on the shelf. So I'm going to say older than 50 years.
You're right for the first one, but it actually didn't sit on a shelf. The first hard disk was invented in 1957 at IBM. It could store 4 megabytes of data across 24 disks. It went into commercial use immediately afterward, and it looked like a stack of vinyl records.
Oh, really?
Except that the records were not vinyl, obviously, but it kind of looks like that.
Records weren't vinyl? I thought it would be like one of those things that like, it shows up and then like they're like, okay, the technology isn't there quite yet. So right now it's really impractical. And then like eventually they're like, all right, it's ready for market.
I mean, it was really impractical, but 4 megabytes was a lot of data back then. So I'm assuming that they were able to stomach that. Because...
Well, yeah, but like, sometimes like tapes, they're like, okay, well, tape can hold way more than that currently. So we're just going to stick with tape until we can figure out how to shrink it down.
That's fair. But I don't know. I'll have to look this up a little bit more. I mostly just looked at the pretty pictures of the large hard disk thing.
This isn't important at all. Just move on with your life, man.
This is very important. This is the preeminent podcast about the history of the first hard drive.
Ah, true. You're right.
Because nobody else has covered
it. Reading me a Wikipedia article.
Mm-hmm. I mean, isn't that most content on the internet nowadays?
It actually is.
It all goes back to Wikipedia at some point. I don't have a good transition for this one, so we're just going to barrel right into it. Hamming distance, and also Hamming ECC. Not to be confused with Levenshtein distance, this is an important metric for error correction. When was that made?
I have no idea. It's mathy, more than 50 years.
Mathy more than 50 years is a very, very good rule to go by, because you are absolutely right. This was 1950. Whew! And this was not to be confused with Levenshtein distance, as I said, which was from 1965. So even if you did confuse it, you'd still be right.
What was the point? Okay, never mind. Keep going.
Well, Levenshtein distance is a slightly different metric, because you can use that one on strings to determine a whole bunch of different things. And yeah, generally, if you're doing string distance, it's Levenshtein distance that you want. But I used to think it was Hamming distance.
I have no idea what you're talking about, but sure.
That's probably for the best. We're talking about graph search algorithms again. You're familiar with A star, I'm sure. That's pretty much how most things search out where they're supposed to go nowadays. It's effectively what? Dijkstra's algorithm with better heuristics. And when was that invented?
I understand it's 0% of that.
Really? You're familiar with Dijkstra's?
I don't know names of things. I know overarching concepts, and then someone has to explain it to me, and then usually I'm like, oh, I know that. Or I'm like, no, I don't know that.
That's the search algorithm for weighted graphs. So this is effectively just that, but it gets done quicker because it has like better internal heuristics.
Oh, okay. Okay, so that's got to be very old, right? More than 50 years?
More than 50 years for sure, but this was 1968. So Dijkstra's algorithm is obviously significantly older because it's built on Dijkstra's algorithm, but A star is relatively recent in terms of ancient history.
Really? Because I thought that would have been like, I don't know. Like graph theory is like very mathy, So I feel like people would have gotten to that way earlier. Guess not.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely old in terms of computer science, but it's not really old in the greater zeitgeist of mathy things for sure.
Yeah, for sure.
All right. Increasing the mathiness, the AI winter, or I guess this is more of like a sociology thing, because this is more of like when we stopped believing in AI, but AI winter.
Greater than 50 years.
Just barely less, actually. I'm doing this from the start of the Lighthill report, which was like effectively the report that dismantled AI research in England because they just determined it to be a big pile of hogwash effectively. And I mean, back then when the computers weren't fast enough to run this kind of stuff, it kind of was.
Yeah.
So in all fairness to them,
Like even today, it's kind of like iffy. It's like, all right, I got to wait for my model to train for the next 7 days.
or even with like symbolic AI, it's, well, I guess we're not getting an answer ever because we're just spinning and we don't know when it's going to return. So this was really the start of it. Got worse over the years. I think there was a little small increase in funding to counter some other projects for like geopolitical national defense reasons, but those all fizzled out because the first one fizzled out. And then everybody stopped caring until about 2010. So speaking of AI, we have Prolog. Rumor has it, by the way, that the Windows networking diagnostic tool is written in Prolog, which is funny because that's actually the only one that has ever fixed a problem for me.
Really?
Yeah. Yeah, it actually does an okay job of figuring out what's wrong. The other one's garbage. The networking tool, pretty okay.
I have not had that experience, but okay. Let's say less than 50 years.
Less than 50 years is correct. Programming languages usually skew a little bit old, but this was 1972. And it's been confusing college students ever since.
Hell yeah.
Strawson's algorithm. This one has a series on the channel going on how to optimize it for certain classes of matrices. The new episode will hopefully drop soon, depending on when I can get my data recorded. When was that one figured out?
I'm going to say over 50 years.
Just barely over 50 years ago, Miles, you are absolutely prescient because it was 1969 that Strawson's algorithm was published.
Hell yeah.
Unfortunately, it's not really in much use today, which is kind of unfortunate because you can get good results with it, but very interesting algorithm and always a fun time to look at it from a computer science perspective. I would highly recommend that anybody who is interested in computer optimization or computer program optimization to take a look at that, as you've seen on the Terminal Velocity series. Plug aside, when was the PDF invented? This one might be a little bit easier.
That one's by Adobe. Less than 50 years. It's definitely less than 50 years.
Definitely less than 50 years. This was 93. The first version of the PDF specification and Adobe Acrobat were released. Ever since, computer programmers have been trying to implement that specification. But apparently Adobe did an okay job of it back in 93.
Huh.
All right. The first online first-person shooter. Voice chat and angry 12-year-old screaming at you not included.
That's less than 50 years ago, right?
Less than 50 years, but again, this was 73 with Maze War. This game was ridiculous. It had like peer-to-peer networking and a client-server architecture. You could play it over the ARPANET, 3D graphics.
What was this game doing?
Regardless, I am very interested in this game now because like there's this whole list of things that it did. Presumably not by modern standards because it was made in the 70s, but
was it like fun? Like, you know what I'm saying? Like, was it a fun game? Like, Pong is strangely fun. It's simple but fun. Was this like overly complicated, weird, and like boring because the technology kind of just sucked then?
I think the idea was that you tried to like you went around in a maze and you could see like in front of you, so you could turn 90 degrees and then like see the hallway in front of you but not the hallway to your right or something like that. And then you would try and like shoot people down that hallway effectively, and you would get a point for shooting them. So assuming in the 70s, if you have not yet played a video game because it's the 70s, you would probably be very satisfied with that, I'd imagine.
Yeah, probably.
I'm sure that people who grew up with Call of Duty would say that it's garbage, but well, actually, Call of Duty is probably not the greatest example for that. At least Maze War doesn't have microtransactions.
Sound pretty ahead of the time. Maybe they were.
I heard that they actually encrypted their source code, so I think it had one of the first video game DRMs to prevent cheating, which is interesting. Yeah. Maybe there's like an emulator for it or something. There's probably a port.
You'd probably need to play with some friends though. Hey guys, you all want to like emulate this game that's probably like, I don't know, about 50 years old. It might not be fun.
You say that, but that's actually the exact pitch that I give to all of my friends every single time I want them to play Supreme Commander with me.
I don't know what that is.
It's the best. I love Supreme Commander.
What is it?
It's the best real-time strategy game ever released. Don't let anybody ever tell you different. And it's huge and it's big. It's very difficult to play at a high level, but it's very fun for that reason. because it's like a big rock, paper, scissors game between you and the other person. And like, it's like a 13-dimensional rock, paper, scissors games. You got like air, you got land, you got navy, you got nuclear defense, you got tactical missiles, you got artillery, you got a whole bunch of other things like drops, various classes of like land units, like hover units that can go over the sea. It's so much fun. So much fun. But it's very difficult to play at a high level. So it's kind of difficult to find skilled friends to play with. So much fun though.
It's like whenever you invite somebody to play Smash Bros with you, and they're like, "Oh yeah, I'm good," and then you realize, no, they're like good. Don't get me wrong, but they're not like, "Oh, I actually practiced this game," kind of good. They're like, "I can beat all my friends in a party."
Yeah, I'm not even that good at it. Like, I'm not like one of the 2000 ELO people. Well under that, but it's still just very difficult to get a grip around. But it's so satisfying when you do. Some of my best gaming moments ever were in Supreme Commander. But anyway, we are on a super tangent.
Super tangent.
God, I wish it supported multi-core. Anyway, when were LCDs invented?
That's early on, right? I'm gonna say more than 50 years ago.
Okay, so this one's also kind of difficult because they were demoed in the late 60s, right? But they were really put into production with TFT displays in like the very like early mid 70s, so like 72, 73, and they were used as watch displays. So I think technically we can say before 1971 for sure. But interestingly, perhaps a little bit more interestingly, when was the, I guess, natural successor to LCDs? When was the OLED display first put into practical use?
That's right. That's definitely less than 50 years, right?
Mm-hmm. This was in 1990. The first practical one was, well, made in 1987 and also 1990, kind of depending on how you want to count it. But the first research was done in the 60s, although that was mostly just passing like electric currents through various crystals and being like, those light up. Interesting. And then led into some more directed display research. So if you want to be really pedantic, you could say the 60s, but I'm not going to be that.
I'm sure lots of these categories are flexible if you get really pedantic about them.
Mm-hmm. But this one is not pedantic whatsoever. So this is very specific. When were the first SIMD instructions put into use? So that's single instruction, multiple data instructions that
I know
operate.
what SIMD is.
All right, Miles, I'm just explaining for the one person who watches this, but you can go ahead.
No, I'm just kidding. SIMD. Single instruction, multiple data. That is, I'm going to say pretty early on. I'm going to say over 50 years ago.
I was expecting you to get tripped up on this one because they were mostly popularized in the 90s, but you are correct. The first SIMD instructions were used in the ILIAC 4. It had 64 64-bit FPUs, which ran one ginormo 4096-bit SIMD lane controlled by one CPU.
I was thinking, whenever resources were so tight back in olden times, I was thinking there's got to be someone who's just like so frustrated with it that he's like, I just need to do a whole bunch of additions really quick, please. Someone alleviate this pain for me. And then he was like, I know what to do.
That's actually a pretty good way of putting it, and especially because this was the era of computers being like ginormous.
Yeah.
So this would take a lot of resources, but I mean, it would be ungodly fast for sure.
Yeah, especially if you're just like, it's got to frustrate someone enough into making it pretty early on.
Yeah, and for reference, this actually surpasses some SIMD lanes today. Like AVX 512 by Intel has 512-bit SIMD lanes compared to the 4096-bit lanes that this thing had in 1966. That's 1/8 as many. Granted, it's a little bit more advanced in most other ways, but that's nuts. And the crazy thing was, this thing was originally planned to have 4 lanes, so you would have around 16,000 bits of SIMD computation here for 400 megaflops of peak throughput. But obviously, there was not enough money to do that. So that may sound impressive, like that 400,000 megaflop thing, and that absolutely was back then. But I looked it up in Intel HD 4000, which is like the first Intel graphics chip to ever support FP64. You can't go any further back than that. That has 64 gigaflops of FP64, and I can tell you from experience, I own one of those things. It's garbage. So just to put this all in perspective.
Okay.
Definitely wouldn't recommend trying to run Crysis on that thing, also because Crysis is FP32, but you get the point.
Yeah, wasn't Crysis like single-threaded anyway?
Yeah, but the GPUs are, a different mode of It still runs okay on modern GPUs in terms of
I get what you're saying. Okay, yeah, my bad.
Because obviously, if you're rendering it at 4K or whatever, or even at 1080p, that's still 2 million things you got. That's more pixels than you have ALUs. So.
Okay, yeah.
But yeah, this machine is definitely the peak of slow car fast, and I can absolutely respect that. It's like a Ferrari from like the 1950s, back when like 170 horsepower was considered screaming.
Oh my gosh.
All right, last one. This is the thing that made pretty much all digital media possible. It's seen in JPEG, MP3, AAC, MPEG, pretty much all the codecs. It's all the codecs. When was the discrete cosine transform first published?
Discrete cosine transform. What does that do?
It is a very efficient way of encoding like a wave kind of function that allows you to compress data significantly more efficiently than other means, like
so
deflate, for example.
That probably wouldn't be too useful too early on. So, well, music, audio. It could have been useful for audio. So I'm going to say over 50 years.
Just barely under 50 years ago, it was published in 1972, which is still mind-blowing because obviously the technologies that use this are all things that you would think about in the 90s and 2000s, but very, very fundamental work of math there, which is still used today, everywhere. Fun fact, it's a discrete cosine transform because you can represent things with cosines more efficiently than you can with sines.
Oh, I didn't know that.
All right, Miles, I don't know what your score is, and frankly, I don't care because we're all winners here, and probably most of that stuff was untrue anyway.
I hate you.
This is an important lesson that all exercises in life are inevitably futile.
Oh, I thought I genuinely was going to get a score at the end of this. I was like,
no,
I wonder how bad I did. And then you're like,
I'm definitely not keeping track. But our one dedicated listener, I can delegate the task to them. Post in the comments how Miles did so I don't have to. That's how you do audience engagement, right? Right? All right, Miles. Well, this was a great time. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
And that's the show. Thanks to Meydän, that's Meyda with an umlaut N, for their track The Beauty of Maths, licensed under the Creative Commons Attribution 4.0 license, which serves as our intro, outro, and interlude music. You can find more in the description of this episode. Please remember that the opinions expressed in this production may not reflect those of other participants on the show, or those of any participants' past, current, or future employers. They're also probably exaggerated a bit for comedy's sake. Anyway, thanks for tuning in.